So we have some important news in the current efforts to remove suppressors and short-barreled rifles from the NFA nationwide. The Trump DOJ recently filed their opposition to a case, and they continue to argue that the NFA's restrictions are valid despite the $0 tax change. And now, also in support of that position by the Trump DOJ, all of the anti-gun groups have jumped into this case in support of that very position. And it's not a good look for the Trump administration when you have all of the anti-gun groups supporting your claims. So let's talk about what is happening now in this critical case. Now, before we jump into this video, I want to thank the sponsor of this video, which is Silent. Now, let's face it, we all know that our phones and other electronic devices like laptops are actually just tracking devices. Big tech, government agencies, and even cyber criminals, they're all collecting our data, and they're doing that through some of our devices. That's why it's always a good option to maybe look into, Faraday bags and other options, and I highly recommend Silent. Their Faraday gear and these bags and other items you can get block all wireless signals, cellular, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, GPS, and a lot of other signals that, government agencies, hackers, all these people use to get into your devices. I use their backpack every single day when I'm going to and from the office. I put my laptop in there, my phone in there, and then also I use it a lot when I'm going through airports or when I'm staying at hotels because, again, I want to protect those devices and I don't want people to get access to my devices, to my phone, or to my laptop. So again, if you're interested, you can protect your privacy, your freedom, and all of your family and your devices by just simply using a Faraday bag. I highly recommend Silent. You can go to silent.com/scholar and you can get 15% off and a free shipping as well on these products. Again, simply just go to slnt.com/scholar. And again, I will link that all down below in the details section and also in the pinned comment. So as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we need to talk about what is happening right now in response to the Big Beautiful Bill and the $0 tax change that was passed through that law. Now, if you've been following the channel for a while, you will know that HR 1 passed, and in that, we only got a reduction of the NFA tax. It took the NFA tax per stamp from $200 all the way to $0, and that's going to start next year. But in response to that, multiple toy organizations have actually moved to finish the job and remove all of the remaining NFA restrictions. So remove, the transfer requirements, the registration, and all of that, remove the NFA essentially for these new items. And this coalition of toy organizations, companies, and states have moved to end this lawsuit and to also end the NFA immediately with a motion for summary judgment. However, the Trump DOJ continues to argue that the NFA's restrictions are still valid despite the new $0 tax change that's going to go in place on these items like SBRs and suppressors. And like I mentioned, now that position by the Trump DOJ, which really is an anti-gun position despite what they are saying, is being supported by every major anti-gun group like Giffords, Brady, and Everytown. Now, in this lawsuit, the pro-toy side argues that since there is no longer a tax on these items like suppressors, SBRs, SBSs, and AOWs, there is no longer a valid constitutional basis to further regulate these items under the NFA. In summary, what GOA and the other plaintiffs asked for in this specific challenge is for the court to declare that the NFA's registration and transfer requirements pertaining to now these untaxed firearms goes beyond Congress's enumerated powers. In this case, they argue that the challenge provisions not only exceed Congress's enumerated powers, they also infringe on Americans' enumerated rights. The Second Amendment protects the right of the people to keep and bear arms. The firearms at issue here undeniably are arms under the term's plain meaning. And under Bruin, that means that the NFA's regulations are presumptively unconstitutional, and the government bears the burden of proving the constitutionality of its actions. So that is what the new lawsuit aims to do in response to the NFA tax changes that just passed in the Big Beautiful Bill. And the plaintiffs filed a motion for summary judgment to end the case sooner rather than later. What this means is that both sides are seeking to end the dispute as soon as possible without going to a full trial. However, the ATF and the Trump DOJ continued to defend the NFA. In their new brief, the Trump DOJ makes multiple arguments for why the NFA should remain a valid law despite the NFA tax change. When it comes to the taxing power question, the Trump DOJ argues that even though the Big Beautiful Bill recently reduced the making and transfer taxes on certain NFA firearms, they claim that the statute still imposes a special occupational tax on manufacturers, dealers, and importers. In the brief, the Trump DOJ states that because the challenged NFA requirements and prohibitions form a web of regulation aiding the collection and enforcement of the NFA's special occupational tax, they are justified under Congress's taxing powers. The DOJ then walks out the Commerce Clause as a basis to still uphold the NFA. The DOJ argues that the NFA regulates the interstate market for short-barreled rifles and shotguns, suppressors, and AOWs. The brief notes that most NFA firearms are manufactured and sold through interstate commerce, and the NFA's requirements attached to each stage of commerce: the manufacture, distribution, sale by dealers, and purchase by the individual. The DOJ went so far as to also state that even where conduct is purely intrastate, meaning that it only, happens within a single state, the DOJ argues that the regulation is still constitutional because unregistered, unregulated submarkets would leave a, quote, what they claim, a gaping hole in the federal scheme. Now, it wasn't surprising that the Trump DOJ and AG Bondi continued to defend the NFA despite the tax change. They got a lot of blowback for that, but then they went online saying that they're still the most pro-2A organization and they support the Second Amendment and all of that stuff. But that's really been their MO when it comes to the NFA. They defend the NFA and then go on, online claiming that they're pro-2A. But now, even worse look for them is the fact that every anti-gun group has jumped into this case in support of the Trump DOJ position. Brady, Giffords, and Everytown have now filed a joint amicus brief in support of what the Trump DOJ is arguing in this case. In the brief, the anti-gun groups argue essentially the same way that the Trump DOJ did in their brief as well. In this brief by the anti-gun groups, they state that Congress has constitutional authority, taxing, and commerce authority to enact the NFA. They also state that the NFA regulated weapons in question, like SBR, suppressors, short-barreled shotguns, AOWs, all of those are uniquely dangerous and still require heightened regulation by the federal government. They also state that Congress preserved registration despite eliminating the tax, and they point to the process that happened with the Big Beautiful Bill, where Congress decided to keep the registration and only reduce the tax. Now, there was a lot to that happened last year. We covered all of that was going on when we were trying to get the SHORT Act and the HBA passed, but we couldn't get all the rhinos in Congress to jump on board for that, and there was issues with the Senate parliamentarian. But now you have Giffords and all these anti-gun groups joining together and pointing to that failure of the process with Congress as a reason why the registration process should remain in place. In the brief, the anti-gun groups state that silencers, short-barreled rifles, and short-barreled shotguns continue to pose a distinct and extreme threat to public safety. And then they go on to state that the NFA's modest, targeted requirements represent a measured response to these enduring risks, preserving lawful access while making it harder for violent criminals. So there are a lot of moving parts now when it comes to the NFA battle. Multiple lawsuits have been launched in response to the $0 tax change, and unfortunately, we still have the Trump DOJ defending the NFA on multiple grounds. And even worse, in a horrible look for the Trump DOJ, now you have every anti-gun group jumping on board in this case in support of what the Trump DOJ is arguing in favor of the NFA. So it's a horrible look for them, but that's what's currently happening in this critical NFA challenge, which is trying to build off of that $0 tax change. I'm sure the Trump DOJ will get a lot of flack for these arguments, as they should, because you cannot claim to be the most pro-2A administration that has ever existed, that will ever exist, and all of that, and make these types of arguments when it comes to the NFA, and then have those very same arguments supported and echoed by every single anti-gun group. So that is what's currently going on in this critical suppressor SBR NFA challenge. As we get more information, as it develops more, I will let you guys know. If you would like to support this channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. You can also check out one of the two videos here on the screen that the YouTube algorithm thinks that you'll find helpful. But as always, thank you guys so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.